All right, let me talk to you a little bit about Benjamin on Kafka and give you a little bit of background and some framing for this. The two essays that you find in Illuminations, one is published in 1934 and another briefer one is published in 1938. The year before Benjamin died, and you probably know broadly the circumstances of his death, that he was escaping the Nazi occupation of France and got to the French border with Spain and found that, sure enough, the gate was closed. Very ironic thing. But despairing, he then committed suicide, even though, of course, the gate opened again the next day, but without him knowing. So the gate, and passing through the gate, has a kind of meaning for the life and for the man. And what's interesting to me as you read through his letters in the 1930s, even up until the very end, he's arguing about Kafka. Okay, so one has to kind of ask a kind of general question like, why is it as the Nazis are taking over Europe and the Jews are being deported and Benjamin's fearing for his life, writing somewhat desperate letters to the New School in New York asking for a visa, and getting very, very slow responses, and from Adorno, barely any at all. He's arguing about Kafka a lot. Something's at stake there, historically. And there's even a moment in a correspondence with Adorno where, did you hear that they deported so-and-so? By the way, I read your Kafka essay. And then paragraphs on that, right? Like the mention of the deportation. Yeah. Paragraphs on Kafka. Okay, well, we could say displacement, or maybe a strange kind of lexicon through which to try to fathom the present, whatever that present might be. And we're already in a crisis of the present, right? We could see that, I think, yesterday in the theses on the philosophy of history. The point was not to reclaim an idea of progress for the present, but actually to establish a revolutionary possibility in the present through remembrance. Now, there's, I think, a set of debates about Benjamin. Is he part of the Frankfurt School? Right? And most people who are teaching the Frankfurt School will teach some Benjamin. But because he wrote in several genres and was a literary scholar, also wrote books that have a fair amount of archival work in them, wrote on visual culture, on the work of art, on technology. It's not clear that he could be easily categorized as a philosopher. It could be that some of the work has philosophical significance or implications. And he brought together several literary, religious, and philosophical traditions, including the Jewish Kabbalah, which I'll talk about a little bit, Marxist views on history, an immersion of Kant, mainly through the work of Hermann Cohen. That was the name I was looking for yesterday, the representative of the Marburg School, who wrote about reason and religion, but also thought that there was a slow and progressive realization of reason in history. And it was against that view that he wrote time and again, even though some of his own Kantian speculations, including the very dense introduction to the German tragic drama book, absorbs that Kantian material. He also was influenced by Nietzsche, the tradition of German aesthetics, to be sure, but also was extremely interested in literary genres and literary eras. So the Baroque was one of his very first books. Also, German Romanticism was his second. He had two theses that he tried to write. Anyway, you'll be glad to know that his first thesis was rejected. So don't feel so bad if you have a hard time here. It was considered unreadable. Some of us are really pleased to join him in the club of the unreadable. And he had a very difficult time. He gave up the idea of actually getting an academic post and had to write independently and get contracts for his writing in order to sustain himself. In any case, it seems to me that he was very often interrogating cultural and historical predicaments of his time, and he did so through readings of literary and aesthetic works, sometimes urban landscapes, especially in the final books, and also consumer practices, fashion, the smoking of hashish, his own Berlin childhood. Any number of things could be a topic for him. But if I were to try to generalize or ask myself, is there a kind of guiding question or guiding set of questions that we could find in Benjamin's work, I would say that it's the question of what time do we live in? What time is it? What time is it? What time do we live in? And is it possible within the time in which we live for there to be something like completed action or satisfied life? I think he asked this question sometimes from a Marxist slant, highly influenced by Bertolt Brecht. And when he did that, he was looking at the effects of depersonalization that an increasingly mechanized society exercises on human life. And other times it seems to me that he was articulating or trying to make use of the resources of what's broadly called Jewish mysticism, but which is in fact a very specific strain of the Kabbalistic tradition, to think about ways of breaking with an historical time that seems to be motoring toward destruction. And so we might say, we might ask what drew Benjamin to Kafka. He reads Kafka not only as a great fiction writer, but as a purveyor of power, right? But also Kafka is one whose literary style is elliptical. That is to say, it does not explain everything about what it is saying. It allows for there to be an enigmatic or cut or abbreviated quality to the language itself. And I think yesterday we looked a bit at that abbreviated cut economic quality in the parable form, and I think you can see some of that mimetically reproduced in Benjamin's own writing. I don't think Kafka is the only source for that, but Benjamin himself doesn't actually lay out an argument in a systematic form, right? He doesn't start with a set of logical principles and then derive his theoretical conclusions from them. He approaches from one angle, he approaches from another angle. The object shifts depending on the angle from which he approaches, which is one reason I wanted to impress upon you the idea of the constellation, or what he at one point called the monad, the kind of congealed entity, as an important phenomenon for him. He distrusted and wrote against forms of rationalism that would seek to make logical and conceptual sense of an otherwise difficult world. He thought that the difficulty of that world had to be thought precisely through historical constellations that permit of various kinds of approaches. Even the idea of illumination, which is so important to him, is understood as through the Kabbalistic idea of an emanation. In the Kabbalistic work, for instance, of Isaac Luria, you have this idea of an original stuff out of which the world emerges. It's called Ein Sof, S-O-F. And there are angels, interestingly enough, Sephirot, excuse my bad Hebrew, angelic illuminations that are dispersed from that original Ein Sof. And they are sparks of divinity, one might say, that scatter throughout the world. This view, this Kabbalistic view, is very, very important to Gershom Scholem in the 1910s. He and Benjamin were in intense conversation about it. And Benjamin took some part of it, although quarreled with other parts. And Scholem's own idea, for instance, of the Messianic changed over time, and in some interesting ways that we can talk about, some of which became politically consequential. But for Benjamin, and interestingly enough for Kafka, in the early teens, the studying of the Kabbalah was extremely interesting. And Benjamin certainly uses this idea of illumination or divine spark, or what you saw, I think, yesterday in the theses on the philosophy of histories, messianic chips, to articulate the possibilities of revolutionary action. Right? What is it that flashes up from the past? What illumination comes toward us from a tower of ruin? And it's not exactly something one would call reason. It's not exactly something one would call intuition, but it is the apprehension of some kind of divinity or messianic dimension that emerges in the midst of a ruin or an image or a memory or a spatial configuration of history of one kind or another. Okay. It would be tempting to try to translate it into the idea of possibility, and I'm tempted to do that myself. But it is there as this idea of light or of emanation, which he transposes into a revolutionary context. And I should just tell you that the transposition of the Messianic into the revolutionary context drove Scholem mad. It also drove Adorno mad for a totally different reason. Adorno didn't want that mysticism in the midst of dialectical materialism. Scholem didn't want his Kabbalah being mixed with revolutionary action that he understood as naive and excessively Brechtian. Right? Scholem was actually arguing with Benjamin's Brecht rather than his Adorno so much. But Adorno was clearly arguing with Benjamin's Scholem. Okay, I have a lot to say, but be quick and
I'll be as quick as I can.
Yeah.
So in terms of Benjamin's relationship to, say, maybe not other Frankfurt thing, but the Frankfurt school, in terms of reason in history, like Habermas talks about the bifurcation of reason, or you get that in the dialectic of enlightenment, like the split, right? Like the sort of like a one moment in which history sort of split against itself. Would you posit Benjamin somewhere in between, say, Scholem and the Frankfurt School?
Well, let's be careful, because Habermas, you may know, has in fact distinguished himself from the Frankfurt School and said very definitively that it erred on the side of aesthetics and that it could not furnish the legitimation for the normative conditions of social and political life.
Okay.
So, and although he has written on Benjamin, his main focus in separating his quasi-transcendental move from the Frankfurt School was Adorno. But it is true that the progressive conceit continues in Habermas, right? Habermas's main idea is that, not his main idea, one of his central principles is that the principles that govern modernity have not yet been fully realized, and that our job politically is to help with the further articulation and further realization of those principles. So what Benjamin is actually doing in his critique of progress is actually saying the very universalization of principles that you think you need to further is precisely the means through which the revolutionary past, or the history of the oppressed and revolutionary action is being covered over. Okay. So it's a much more radical break.
Yeah.
It's a much more radical break.
Right.
And it's not reason, right? It's not, and for that, and for Habermas, after very clear post World War II, for him, any position that does not ground itself in rationality is irrationalist and therefore potentially complicit with forces like fascism or anarchism or nationalism. Right, so the reason it must stand as a bulwark against those nefarious kinds of forces, and unfortunately, that move ended up demeaning the entire aesthetic dimension of the Frankfurt School. So the efforts to go back and recover that have been, I think they're easier now in German scholarly work than they were 20 years ago, but certainly was a very was a very big fight. But yes, another question.
I just wanted to ask quickly, and maybe I'll get there, but this is the part of Benjamin that I would like maybe a little more explanation on, is that it seems like this apprehension of the oppressed past in the form of like a crystallized image of, time being frozen, kind of. The way you've described it is kind of like an intuition that overtakes us, and we feel it, and it takes place in maybe an imagistic form, and some of that we can see in Benjamin's writing with the Tower of Debris building up of catastrophe. How else can we access that image, I guess? Is it just always going to be something that's like intuition, or that we feel and comes out? Or is there some way that this image gets conveyed to the rest of society so we can all be taken up in it? Or,
okay. So let's remember, interestingly enough, in the Arcades Project, which is a great thing to read if you can. It's very heavy to carry, so for those of you who have it, you can't really download it, I don't think. It's really... I always travel. Oh, I think I'll read. No, I guess not. It's like I like parables. It's like wow. Let's remember this. This strange illumination, which we may have all kinds of doubts about, but this strange illumination or flashing up, it comes to us through language and through objects, and in the arcades, it actually comes on the street and through the commodity. And tomorrow morning, I'm actually going to try to link for you Kafka Benjamin and Adorno on the problem of commodity fetishism. Okay, because, and this will show you a kind of a split within Marxism that happens over Kafka. And we'll read Cares of a Family Man, which is the short piece on Odradek, and we'll read a little bit about from the correspondence of Adorno and Benjamin, where they're actually arguing about Baudelaire, but they are arguing about the same problem, which is whether a certain kind of reified object, which has lost its human character, which seems to resemble a human character, which seems to actually be the epitome of commodity fetishism in the sense that this is a human subject that seems remade into an object. That there's still something that emerges from that that less than human creature, or that more or less objectified entity that for Benjamin still holds that kind of revolutionary messianic spark. And how does that come through? That's the question we have to ask. But it's not something we bring to it. It's not subjectively constituted. It doesn't depend on our having a faculty of intuition. It actually very much comes from the object world. And yet there is a certain kind of agency in Benjamin, especially in the Theses in Philosophy of History, where he talks about what the historical materialist does. Right? He blasts, he opens, he fights. There is a moment of struggle involved in the approach to the messianic, or the response to the messianic, but it's not contemplative. It's not contemplative. It's actually in the form of action, which makes it interesting when you think about the Flaneur, for instance, his final work because is he absorbing passively what happens on the street, or is he walking? Is he walking? Is he in motion? Right? Is he part of the scene and implicated in it? In a longer seminar, we could probably do that. So let me just say a couple of things. In the one essay, Benjamin begins with the story of Potemkin, you might remember, and then moves to a story about Kafka's father. And what Benjamin emphasizes is the following: that commonplace things have their weight. Okay, commonplace things have their weight. The world that Kafka is describing is one in which human elements seem to be transformed into industrial elements, and it's not possible to tell them apart. And he offers a mode of description that allows this to become clear. So, for instance, when at one point Kafka, Benjamin cites clapping hands in Kafka, and claims that the clapping hands in one of Kafka's passages are really steam hammers. Kafka does not say that the hands are like steam hammers. I mean, that would be one thing, if the hands were like steam hammers. That would be to produce a simile, which maintains the difference between the two terms compared. In the Kafka quotation, the hands are steam hammers, right? So it's an ontological transformation of the hands into steam hammers. And this leaves us, I think, with a very uncanny sense. The tone is familiar. It's even an everyday tone. The gesture in which the hands are clapping is surely not particularly noteworthy. It forms part of the background of everydayness. But for the hands to be really steam hammers, I wonder if somebody can actually find this quickly. Let's see if that's right. Right, I'm not going to be able to
Page
find it.
113.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I was there, but I wasn't able to find it. Okay, yes, on many occasions and often for strange reasons, Kafka's figures clap their hands. Once the casual remark is made that these hands are really steam hammers. Okay, there we go. So, what I want to just say about this is that for the hands to be really steam hammers means that something has happened to those hands and that something has happened to the everyday. A transformation at the ontological level has happened within the everyday. Their noise, which forms part of the din of applause or another attention-getting device, has become deafening. They've lost their organic function and status. There's a nascent sense that there might be a person somewhere who listens, the one for whom hands are really steam hammers, and one for whom the organic human world has been really transformed through the figure of industrial weight, strength, and power. Okay, so on the one hand, from a kind of Marxist point of view, you could say this is the moment. You'll remember in Commodity Fetishism in Marx, where he says, under capitalism, objects assume human potency and power, and humans acquire the attributes of objects, and that inversion is the substance of commodity fetishism, which produces a personified object and a reified person. Right? So here, it seems to me, just in a kind of brief moment, we have an image in which a large and loud industrial instrument has taken the place of a human hand, and that's a significant kind of replacement. So, at a superficial level, you could say that something living seems to have become lost, and yet the hands still clap, right? So if the hands still clap, something living lives on in a strangely mechanical way. There's a kind of anima, or living force that happens there, that still is in the middle of that industrial clapping. And I think one of the things that Kafka does is get us to see this strangely anachronistic and persistent anima as it enters into the process of what I've called reification, the reification of the human. Now, when Benjamin considers this, he considers these. Okay, we have to imagine it somehow clapping hands as steam hammers. It's actually a great figure because one can imagine a kind of Brechtian theater piece in which the audience is like, we're all steam hammers here. But the clapping hands is certainly a gesture. It's a bodily gesture. It matters that it's the hands that are at issue here. And on, I think, your page 121, he said, Benjamin claims what Kafka could see least of all was the gestus, Gestus. Each gesture is an event, one might say, a drama in itself. Okay. So, what Kafka could see least of all was the gestus. Each gesture is an event, one might say, a drama in itself. So, on the one hand, Benjamin is claiming that Kafka gives us examples of this gesture. On the other hand, he seems to be saying that Kafka could not see this very well. I wonder why. Why is it that Kafka could not see it very well? It may be that Kafka didn't understand what he was articulating, and that Benjamin comes along, or Benjamin and Adorno come along together in order to articulate it more fully as a concept of the gesture. There is a little essay by Adorno on Kafka, which you can find in his volume called Prisms, but I don't think I assigned that to you, which is fine. But it's just something you can put down as something that you might find interesting. But they're working with Benjamin's idea of the gesture. Adorno writes that gestures are traces of experience covered over by signification. Gestures are the traces of experiences covered over by signification.
There is also Agamben.
Sorry.
Agamben in one book also speaks about that.
Yes, he does. Yes, he does. Yes, he does. And so does also about Odradek. That's correct. That's right. In very early work, stanzas. Yes.
Could you repeat that just once more? Gestures are.
Okay. So for Adorno, he claims that gestures are the traces of experiences covered over by signification. Okay. Now, if we think about that there are traces of experience covered over by signification, we might think again about how it is that the discourse of progress, or the discourse of mankind progressing, seeks to cover over the history of the oppressed and produces its tower of debris, right? But Benjamin was also worried that there were forms of signification, including the discourse of progress of humankind, that cover over traces of experience. And what are gestures? Gestures are the reanimation of what is covered over. They are those traces, in some sense, animated. Okay, over and against those modes of signification that would cover them over. And in fact, gestures, for both Adorno and for Benjamin, become important concepts for interrupting and exposing the smooth functioning of what Adorno calls signification and what Benjamin more precisely identified as the problem of progress, including the progress of reason, by the way.
What does he mean just by the term cover up by signification?
Covered over.
Covered over.
Covered over by signification.
So does that mean they sort of fuse in a way, or does
No,
that
it means that there's a process of forgetting or of plunging into oblivion, of rendering or putting into oblivion or forgetfulness.
So, I understand gestures, then there's almost a reflexive quality, so gestures cover over, but
No,
also,
I'm sorry.
Gestures reanimate, but
That which is covered over by signification. They reanimate the traces of that which is covered over by signification.
But isn't a gesture significatory in itself?
Well, gestures aren't quite signification.
Okay, all right, gotcha.
Okay?
Fair enough.
Gestures aren't quite signification. There's something else. And let's see where we get.
Agamben's approach is then related to Benjamin when he says something like people lost their gestures. It's like
To lose your gesture is to lose even the trace of what has been covered over.
Yeah.
It's even a more radical foreclosure, right? Like a gesture is still something animated from the past that is in the process of being covered over or was covered over and is breaking out. But if you lose your gesture, you actually lose the trace. Look, Agamben is extremely important here, and he's covered this before. But the one thing that Agamben, I think, does not do, and he doesn't have to do everything, right, is to consider what the Kabbalistic background is, and also to think a little bit about ways in which atonement and remembrance function within the Jewish tradition. So I feel like he can give you a lot here, and he's, of course, quite impressive in how he's worked with this material. But let's remember that I think the domain of the Kabbalistic and some of the Jewish ritual practices are not there. I can tell you a little bit about what implications those have. The other person to read here is Samuel Weber, who has this beautiful new book out on Benjamin's capabilities. And he's done some of the most important work on the concept of the gesture in Benjamin. So if you want to pursue this, it's a terrific book. I believe it's Stanford University Press, the Meridian series, Benjamin's Capabilities. So Adorno actually has one idea of gesture, which he borrows from Benjamin, and there are some differences between them. But let's just say what you need to know right here is that the bodily gesture emerges as a remnant or ruin of truth, a remnant or ruin of some truth that's been covered over or is in the process of being covered over. And that it's extremely important that the gesture not be the same as language, because the gesture does not communicate in a propositional form. It doesn't give us actual content. It's an enigmatic remain, an animated and enigmatic remain, which is why it's also belongs to the domain of drama and the domain of the event, rather than to the domain of language understood as communicative or as signifying. It's not a full signification, right? The gesture, it's like something once meant something, right? My steam hammer hands are clapping. This once meant something very different when my steam hammer hands were human hands and I was sitting in the opera in Vienna, right? But what is left for us now, and remember, we're interrogating the now time, we're interrogating what is possible now, how is experience structured now. What happens now is that the hands lift, clap, not like steam hammers, but they are really steam hammers, right? Which is not just a perceptual confusion on the part of a gifted novelist, but some kind of ontological transformation has taken place such that we can now say the hands are really steam hammers and they are decontextualized from whatever. There's no opera house, there is no performance. This once signified, we were once able to locate it, contextualize it, and understand its signification. It's the remnant of a signifying act. And as the strangely animated remnant of a signifying act, it is a gesture, and not signification.
Does this refer to like the macrophysics of experience or the microphysics of experience? Like, is this like it once meant something in my life, or it once meant something in history?
It once meant something historical.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
We're in an historical problem.
I got confused because of Vienna clapping.
Well, Vienna and clapping, they're both very historical practices. Clapping in Vienna goes way back. People clap, they don't clap, they walk out, they stand, they clap a lot, they holler, bravo, right? These are deep historical cultural conventions.
Yeah.
And if I use the example of the I who claps, it's not that this is an I who's not historical or who's not in the grip of conventions, right? And even this, I mean, where did I get this from? This comes from some other country than the one in which I was born, right? But it travels with me. Who knows where this comes from?
Could you just elaborate on the difference between action and gesture?
Yes. Well, we talked about action in terms of revolutionary action, right? And gestures can convey or emanate, revolutionary potential for historical materialists who can act in relation to them. But a gesture is neither fully an action, nor is it fully a signification. It's a frozen action, you might say, or a stalled, in stillstellen.
Potentialized action?
Well, here's the question. There's certain kinds of gestures, like if it seems like I'm going to kill a bug, right? You can see me ready, and you understand what the potential is, and you can see the end. But in the kinds of gestures we're talking about, this is happening in such a way that we can't see where it comes from, and we can't see where it goes. It's not as if there's a potential that is going to be realized. It's frozen, and it's decontextualized, and it's without apparent purpose or realization.
But can't potential embody that? The fact that it's not necessarily going to be realized. Isn't that what potential actually means?
Well,
it's possible for you to use it out, but it may not.
what I want to say to you is that in this concept of the gesture, what the frozen gesture can convey is a lost world, or a lost set of meanings, or a reflection on Brechtian theater, really. He furthers his discussion of gesture there, and it's in that context, I believe, on page 151 of your text, that he talks about actors being involved in the quotation of gestures, right? So we think of quotation usually as something that happens through verbal discourse or written discourse, but what Benjamin insists is that quotation is actually something that happens at the level of bodily practice. So an actor quotes his own gesture on the stage. Okay, an actor is in a gesture, making a gesture, but is also, in some sense, quoting that gesture. And when that happens, when a gesture is quoted, we could say, if you can imagine the bodily equivalent of a gesture put in quotation marks, when that happens, the gesture loses its function in everyday life and becomes foregrounded as an isolated act whose signification is uncertain. Okay, so one thing that happens there, and this is part of Benjamin's interest in Brechtian theater, is that he does not want the gesture to be renormalized or domesticated within an existing social context. He doesn't want gesture to be explained by virtue of existing rituals and practices, or life worlds, or language games in the Wittgensteinian sense. What he wants to do is understand the gesture as isolated from its traditional supports, or losing its function within everyday life and becoming an explicit and emphatic event or drama. So we have to remember, I think, that when a gesture is acted or spoken, it's not quite the same as a full action. It doesn't have the immediate instrumental value of an action. And a gesture that quotes an action has to be understood as an interruption of action, right? A gesture is usually put into play in ordinary life, in a particular life world or a particular language game, for the purposes of accomplishing a certain kind of action. What happens in Kafka, and indeed what Benjamin would say what happens in Brecht as well to some degree, is that the immediate instrumental value of an action is suspended. And what we get instead is a gesture that quotes an action, and that functions as an interruption of that very action. Okay, so for Brecht, you'll know he wants to in some sense, stop everyday action from happening because everyday action is more or less complicit with the operations of power and exploitation. And you saw in Benjamin that moment where he calls on the messianic as a cessation of happening, right? As a standing still of happening. And this is, of course, also a very important moment in Agamben when he reads A Critique of Violence, and he talks about what it is to bring to a halt the machinery of power. Okay, something we find in Benjamin at the end of A Critique of Violence. But here, when he's talking about epic theater and gesture, which links his discussion of Kafka with Brecht, it seems clear, he writes, the more we interrupt someone in the act of acting, the more gestures result. The more we interrupt someone in the act of acting, the more gestures result, right? So interruption is a condition for the production of gesture. What could that possibly mean? Well, what it means is that the more we accept the flow or continuity or everydayness of daily gestures, maybe gestures of compliance, gestures of subordination, gestures of everyday life that obscure the workings of power in one way or another, the fewer gestures emerge. But the more we're able to produce interruptions and break up the continuity of everyday life, then actions get distilled in time, they get stopped in time, they become gestures. We could say they're arrested actions, and they cease to be functional, right? We in some sense, block the functional or instrumental possibilities of action. And that's what gestures do. They take an action, they stop it from being deployed in its usual instrumental way, and they bring it into relief as event or drama, which also implicitly is a critique of instrumentality, right? So we could ask the question, does the gesture act or does it fail to act? I think probably we need to understand the gesture as arrested action and as incomplete signification that calls our attention to what action usually is, and therefore allows us to become critical of how it works and interruptive of its mechanical or progressive motion. Now, for Benjamin, the gesture is also to some degree shocking. It produces a shock, a jolt. And if you're interested in the problem of shock and jolt in Benjamin, then you have to go read his essays on Baudelaire, because that's where he really lays it out. But you could see that what he's looking for in theater, Brecht, what he's looking for in Kafka, are shocking interruptions or intervals that work to stop the illusions of everyday life, that in some sense recall what has histories that have been covered over, and that produce what he calls a critical reaction. Okay, so we could ask, how is a critical reaction different from a revolutionary action? But I gather they're connected in some important way for him. When the gesture no longer functions seamlessly within what phenomenologists call a natural attitude, or what Wittgensteinians might call a life world, or a game of life, then we cease to take for granted contemporary ways of structuring time. Right? Time does not flow ceaselessly. Actions don't complete themselves in time. Time itself is interrupted by incomplete actions and by the proliferation of gestures. And once a gesture is isolated or arrested, and once it is understood as quoting itself, which is very interesting, self-quotational, Like, that is to say, it's not functioning or instrumentalizing, but it's calling attention to what its function and instrumentality has been, and also perhaps what it covers over, and what its work is in the ordinary reproduction of power. Then it seems that it can refer to the historical conditions from which it emerges in a different way. It doesn't embody them, it doesn't ratify them. Rather, it allows a critical distance on them. It doesn't reproduce those conditions. Rather, it sets up a relation between arrested action or incomplete speech and those historical conditions that allow for a sense of shock or astonishment about how they function and what they do. In other words, functional or instrumental actions are put out of play. They're unemployed. They become unemployed. The gesture is the unemployed action, right? It's no longer doing its job. It's no longer reproducing historical conditions seamlessly. It's not working, and when it ceases to work, it produces a critical distance between the historical conditions it's supposed to be ratifying and reproducing, and those that no longer serve as its support. In other words, gestures end up showing something. They borrow from theatricality, to be sure, but instead of saying something that we can understand independently, or doing something, completing an action, they produce a critical function or a critical distance. Again, the question of how that's related to revolutionary action is still one. And this capacity for an arrested or punctuated form of showing is crucial to what Benjamin has called its critical function. Now, the only other thing I want to say about this is that Benjamin takes from this idea of gesture something really important for his own thinking. He says, for instance, on page 150, that the discovery of historical conditions takes place through the interruption of happenings. Okay, the cessation of happenings. In other words, it becomes possible to discover and understand historical conditions once they are no longer operating seamlessly, functionally, instrumentally, when they're interrupted or arrested. So it's through the interruption of happenings that this discovery of historical conditions takes place, and it also involves an alienation from those historical conditions. Now you can see here that there's a little tension between the idea of gesture he gets from Kafka and the idea of gesture he's pulling from Brecht. Because with Kafka, there is this sense that the world that once functioned has fallen away and is no longer available to us. So there's a loss and a problem of remembrance. That becomes important for Benjamin when he talks about revolutionary action as being bound up with remembrance and the demand to lay hold of the history of the oppressed and to save it from oblivion. With Brecht, of course, it becomes different. There's a tactical effort made to wrench the gesture from its historical conditions, its everyday operations, and this active separation of the gesture from its historical conditions provides for the critical intervention. Okay. So the Brechtian idea has a much more active, directorial intervention at work. With Kafka, something else is happening. But for Benjamin, drawing on both, he comes up with this very strong claim on 151, interruption is one of the fundamental devices of all structuring. Interruption is one of the fundamental devices of all structuring. It's a strong claim, and it's an enigmatic claim, but you can see that it has a certain anarchist potential, right? And Benjamin's own kind of affiliations with an anarchist point of view are also there toward the end of the Critique of Violence. He actually refers explicitly to anarchism. But interruption is one of the fundamental devices of all structure. Phrases, expressions are repeated, quoted, and though they are derived from an ordinary sense of how things are, they turn the everyday into something astonishing, shocking, or jolting. And it's only through that dislocated sense of astonishment or shock within the everyday that something critical emerges. And this is one way that Kafka, insofar as he offers us a theater of gestures within his writing, is most clearly linked to Benjamin's version of critical theory. It's also a way in which the importance of truncated speech or incomplete phrases or incomplete gestures become essential to this critical function. In other words, if the action were to be completed, or if the phrase were to complete itself in a propositionally acceptable way, it would become functional, it would become instrumentalizable, and it would reproduce the ordinary conditions of life when it's actually a critical distance on those ordinary conditions which alone will allow for a kind of revolutionary action and the inception of a new calendar, right? The break with existing calendars, the break with existing historical regimes, and the inception of a new calendar or a new time. Okay, so the point is not to locate a quotation, bodily quotation, within a readily recognizable context, right? But rather to encounter quotation, citation, as precisely the interruption of a context, which would make quotation into a version of a strike, right? It's like going on strike against the everyday. Now, kind of two final remarks on this issue. One has to do with what's the difference between theatricality and textuality. What does it mean to say that Kafka's writing is a theater of gestures? That's a strange thing to say. There are very important theatrical moments in Kafka. There's the Oklahoma Theater company in his novel America. There are theatrical addresses. There's the theatrical performance of Josephine or the Mouse Folk. So theater is very important for Kafka, and his own engagement with the Yiddish theater was extremely important, especially for his early writings. And he drew, I think, quite easily and happily from that for many writings. But what I want to suggest to you is that at least in what is epic theater, Benjamin draws the analogy between a gesture and a text. And he writes a wonderful line: an actor must be able to space his gestures the way a typesetter produces spaced type. Okay? So an actor must be able to space his gestures the way a typesetter produces spaced type. But you can see that Benjamin is, in both instances, in the theatrical and in the textual, really interested in the problem of the interval, in the space between, that allows for a certain kind of interruption of continuity, since it's continuous time, and it's the continuity of progress, and it's homogeneous, empty time that relies on continuity, that he's trying to break up in these various forms, through descriptions, through textual moments, both of which could be understood as gestural. And again, in Benjamin's thesis on the philosophy of history, we see very clearly that there's an interval between each thesis. Right? There's an interruption. If we wanted to make it into a systematic whole or a logical excursus that follows causally, sequentially, narratively, we would not be able to do it because it is broken up and it calls for, politically, textually, a breaking up of continuity, and understands its critical function to be constituted in that interruption, right? So the text itself interrupts its continuity at the same time that it's trying to make a kind of argument, I want to say a kind of argument, for that interruptive capacity. Okay, so what I would like to do, if we can do this, we can read together The Great Wall of China. I'm happy to do that, although we're going to be spending the afternoon reading Kafka with Avital and Lawrence. Or I can talk to you more about the Messianic in Benjamin. And you can be passive and grumpy students.
Messianic.
Yeah, can you do the Messianic?
Look at you!
Yeah,
Check
not because
it
you want
out.
to pass it, because it's so intriguing.
Really?
Yeah.
What
God.
would you rather do?
I'm happy to do anything. I've got my tea. I have multiple happinesses here. Let's hear from some of the quiet people in the corner. Someone? Anyone?
I have no preference.
Okay. Are you doing okay over there?
Yeah, it's coming. It takes time, but today is much better than yesterday, I must say. Even just the speaking at the beginning that you gave. I don't know. It's
Oriented.
organized.
Does it help if I go slowly and I repeat myself?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Would we talk about this, the gesture in the image?
Yes. Yes? Okay, yes. Tell me what you would like to talk about there. I mean, I do have some... it's interesting. I mean, the gesture is a frozen image, right? It is and remember, we can't do this well here, but one of the moves that Benjamin makes time and again is to take a temporal problem like history and show how it becomes spatialized. And he even has a discussion of melancholia in on the German tragic drama, the Trauerspiel book, where he talks about how certain times from the past are only become available as landscape or as setting or as image. So what he's following time and again is how time gets congealed into imagistic form or panoramic form, or as a visual landscape of one kind or another. And that continues right into the late work, where he's talking about urban landscapes. At which point, the critical question is, how do these kinds of frozen histories emerge? Now, the gesture is a kind of a frozen history, right? In a way, a gesture comes from somewhere, that somewhere is lost, or the gesture is cut off from that history, and then the history reemerges in some kind of animated, partial, trace form within the gesture. So we have the idea of image, but we also have the idea of some kind of emanation or light coming through the image, which is why luminosity is a very important dimension of the visual field for him. Now, the dialectical image is a separate issue which relates to all of this. But even there, by insisting that certain kinds of tensions can be discerned in configurations or spatial configurations, he's not looking for a logical way to overcome contradictions, even in capitalism. He's not interested in a Hegelian mediation of opposition or contradiction. He's actually interested in coming up with an image that can hold in tension divergent kinds of moments of history. So for him, the image in some ways takes the place of dialectical resolution and rational reconciliation. It doesn't seek reconciliation, it seeks to find an adequate mode of presentation, which is variably for him spatial and usually visual, but not always. Not always.
When thinking of images and crystallization, and I'm not saying that they hit the same order, but can we enter into dialogue with Deleuze writes in Cinema 2 of the crystal image and the crystallization of time in film? How would they enter into dialogue?
Yeah.
Or,
I don't know. It's a good question.
I was thinking
Yes.
yesterday in the bar.
Yes, in the bar.
We were talking about the theater of the oppressed.
Yes.
Yeah, do you know? what
Yes.
is it? But I will skip that part. And we were talking also about the gestures on cinema for actors, because we were with Guy Garcia who was here, and he was saying like, well, now in cinema you just you don't need to act. There's just a director, the film director, that says you move from here to there, and then you watch in that direction. So I was, since you were speaking about talking about this, I was thinking about Antonioni's films and,
Yes.
and the long sequence. There is in this film a reporter with Jack Nicholson.
Yeah.
The final part of the film is a long sequence, a séquence
With Jack Nicholson.
with Jack Nicholson. Yeah. So there is a landscape through a window, and a lot of things happen with sound of people walking. So there are gestures from people anyway, and you understand what is happening without having this way of cutting in cinema, because the gestures on cinema, when there are no long sequence, the actors do something and the gesture sometimes is interrupted. It is just the cutting and the montage that makes like a kind of sense, but everything, the interruption is not in the gesture itself.
It's
in the cutting.
It's in the cut.
Yeah. So in Antonioni's film, I was thinking about what you said, that in gestures there is action that is not especially like a language. And I was trying to relate that to some kind of experience of how I see that from my point of view. And I was wondering, so then how can we understand sometimes very well working in a city, gestures of people? I'm thinking particularly when you go to a place that you don't know absolutely nothing, so then you cannot understand gestures because you don't know the history that is behind those gestures.
Yes.
I mean, when you catch in the gesture, the space, the history in an only crystallized moment. So when you understand very well the gestures, and I'm thinking particularly in Colombia, or in some kind of moments where you really know for some kind of gestures that it is better not to be there, and it's better to move, because there will be maybe something that will happen, but just because little details on gestures, on some people, how they regard, how
Mhm.
they
Mhm.
fix the. So I always thought that there were like a language with the body, and
Mhm.
but now I'm understanding better this other perspective
Mhm.
of history.
Mhm.
But I'm trying to relate this with media also. And
Well, you should,
image,
and you know,
know,
for Benjamin too, I mean, you have to remember that although he's working with literature and theater and thinking about Kafka and Brecht, he's also going to be talking about photography and to a certain extent cinema. And by the time he gets to the Passagenwerk, the Arcades Project, sorry, in many languages, he's actually talking about the visual cuts that happen within urban landscapes and even within
with landscape.
with landscape, but also with reproducible images and iconicity that's technically reproducible. So, you know, he's moving between modes of media presentation as he develops this idea. And in a way, I'm giving you the kind of rudiments, you know, literature, theater, but it actually does continue. And whether the term gesture continues to be the most important, it seems to me that Joel Schaff cut citationality, all of that, and the dialectical image continues. Anyway, I guess I'd like to try to think a little bit about remembrance and image and see whether we can make a little more sense of these terms in the brief time that's left to us this morning. So in the theses on the philosophy of history, we saw that Benjamin makes reference to this idea of flashing up, which seems to involve the sudden emergence or breaking forth of another temporality into one, the present one, characterized by uniformity and progress. That whatever flashes up seems to appear suddenly and then to disappear. He writes, for instance, that the true picture of the past flits by. The past can be seized only as an image which flashes up at an instant, at the instant when it can be recognized and is never seen again. So it flashes up at the instant when it can be recognized and is never seen again. So it doesn't stay around. And later he says, to articulate the past historically does not mean, and I mentioned this to you yesterday, it doesn't mean to recognize it the way it really was. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger, wie sie im Augenblick eine Gefahr aufblitzt. Okay. So on the one hand, it flashes up at an instant when it can be recognized, anerkannt, and then here it can be, one has to seize hold of this memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. Okay, so I don't know if we can seize hold of it, but I'm not sure we can keep it, right? And we can think about what that seizing hold actually is or does. Now, something flashes up, but something also flashes through an historical continuum, understood as the historical progress of mankind. And this historical progress of mankind takes place against the background, as we've said several times now, of homogeneous and empty time. And sometimes it seems that this flashing up is something like an explosive device, as when he remarks that the awareness of the revolutionary classes at the moment of their action is such that they are about to make the continuum of history explode. Right? So it seems to be kind of politically insurrectionary explosion. But this moment of action, which must be related to the seizing hold of the memory as it flashes up, this moment of action converts empty time into what he has called full time, and this experience seems to belong, interestingly enough, to the historian rather than to the activist. So one question we could have is whether the historical materialist as an historian also has to be a revolutionary actor, or is implicitly a revolutionary actor, or whether these are separate. Okay.
And what is his point of view? Is separating the two? Or?
Well,
He talks about
it's, for
historian.
me, it's an open question as I'm reading this. I will be interested to know whether that question can be resolved. So the understanding of how the past continues to enter the present brings one into greater proximity with what he calls the time of the now, or Jetztzeit. And this Jetztzeit, the time of the now, is not just a simple present. It's not the punctual now, this moment, hardly. It is a sense of time, we might even say configuration of time, which he says is shot through with chips of messianic time. In other words, this now time would be one in which another temporality interrupts this one time and again. So it's shot through with messianic time. Now, who knows, being shot through with messianic time might also be kind of an explosive activity. The chips that have shot through present time are clearly supposed to interrupt its homogeneity. So here we see the interruptive function again. Something outside of homogeneous and empty time is then found lodged within its trajectory in parts and fragments and chips. So even within homogeneous and empty time, there are chips of what it seeks to foreclose or cast into oblivion. And if the chips are messianic, and chips here can, I think, also be read as traces, then we're not going to find the messianic in the form of some human. Right? The messianic does not appear in human form. It will neither be an anthropomorphism, nor will it be a discrete event, like it happened in time. It happened on that day. Okay. Rather, the messianic will be something that's broken off, or shooting through, or broken off, having shot through, and now flashing up. Okay? It's got to be understood as these bits and pieces of another time that have a way of flashing up or interrupting continuous, homogeneous time. Okay, so the messianic is not a time to come that we can elaborate with beautiful images, nor is it really a person, or an individual, or an anthropos of any kind. It is to be found precisely in those chips and traces that flash up, interrupt, or shoot through. And in the 17th thesis, he tells us that the Messiah will not be understood as a redeemer, but rather as an antichrist. Okay, it's a very odd moment. He says, der Messias kommt ja nicht nur als der Erlöser, not only as the Redeemer, kommt als der Überwinden des Antichrist. Okay, I'm sorry. So he comes as the overcoming of the Antichrist.
Yeah.
Okay.
Big difference.
Big difference. But we don't quite know what's standing for Christ, for the Antichrist, or who the one is who will overcome the Antichrist. He does, I actually think in a way he's saying the Messiah is not Christ, and the Messiah is not Nietzsche. It's not Zarathustra, right? It's not the one who comes as the Antichrist, and it's not the one who comes as Christ. It's rather, it's no one, if you'll permit me that indulgence, it's no anthropos, it's no human form. Okay. And remember, of course, Benjamin's final line of these theses, every second of time was the straight gate through which the Messiah might enter. Every second of time was the straight gate through which the Messiah might enter. This is very important because we're going to be reading before the law this afternoon. Now, if every second of time understood as the Jetztzeit, now time, carries within it the potential for the Messiah to enter, might enter, then every second of time is shot through with the Messianic. And interestingly enough, we have an architectural figure, the straight gate, for the second of time. Right? It's not a punctuated moment, it's already a figure, the straight gate. Which brings us back to my destination, because you'll remember that writer, that master who's at least who's prepared or unprepared to go through the gate, doesn't actually go through the gate. In the parable, we don't know whether he's going through the gate. The parable ends with the possibility that he's going through the gate. Something's going through the gate. Before the law, the man who comes to the law waits before the gate, seeing if he might pass through, or if something might pass through, some light passes through toward him. There's a problem with that light there. But here, Benjamin offers us, I think, a very Kafkian formulation, suggesting that the Messianic has to be understood as something of a wager. The Messiah might enter. The Messiah might enter. It's not wird kommt, he will come when. It's rather, he might enter. He might enter. And it's not that a Messiah will come, sure prediction, or has come, historical fact, but rather what we call the Messianic is always on the order of what might enter. And here again, I think we have a sense of what might enter a certain established temporal horizon. It's not quite shooting through or flashing up, but simply entering, as one enters a gate or enters through a door, some opening onto another time. But what might enter through the door or the gate is not exactly a figure. Not exactly a figure. It's a trace, it's a chip, it's a light. It functions as a disruption to temporality, or it functions as the interruption of one temporality by another temporality, right? The ending of one calendar in favor of another, or the opening up of a different time from the one that has claimed to be time. And it matters which of these interpretations we choose, because on one reading, the Messianic puts an end to time and constitutes a cessation of happening, right? Messianischen Stillstellung des Geschehens. But on another reading, some forgotten set of histories, though that which belongs to the history of the oppressed, flashes up and makes a sudden claim on revolutionary action in the present, which means that past time comes up and interrupts a present time. And it matters whether our aim is to stop history as we know it, like simply put an end to it, and to go on strike against current temporal regime, refuse to act, or whether our task is actually remembrance, which is different, because that involves a reconstellation of present time in which a forgotten or foreclosed history of the oppressed may well enter through the gate, the door, And the memory that flashes up may become the occasion for revolutionary action. And it seems to me that these are two different images. They're two different ways of understanding the Messianic. The cessation of happening as an end in itself, and the strike would be the paradigmatic moment for that. But then there's another which I think focuses on remembrance, the flashing up of memory, and how that becomes what is seized by revolutionary action.
Is it? Can we say that there are like two forces? One is the one of the materialist historian, which his action is also related to, has a messianic character with rapture in time, and the other is those threads, those glittering threads, that somehow invites the action of the materialistic historian, and somehow the fusion of those two, it's like create like a temporal event or possibility of an event.
Well, it's possible, and it would be great to work that out if that's possible. And I think the most I can say right now, in a tentative way, is that what we're coming up against is something of the more spiritual dimension of Benjamin's idea of the Messianic, which is involved in this problem of remembrance and the flashing up of memory. And then there's another one which is more often than not identified as a kind of Marxist, even anarchist position, which simply calls for the emergency brake to be pulled on the machinery of the state or in the reproduction of power relations. Right. So cessation of happening is the.
It's actually the two figures.
These are the figures. So I'm not. I'm not.
Is it the moment of?
Well, maybe they fuse. Maybe they don't fuse. Maybe they're in tension with one another. Adorno says they're incompatible. Scholem says they're incompatible.
This is what's unique about Benjamin.
But Benjamin, and they want to say they're incompatible for completely different reasons. Right? So it's a wager, it's a risk, whether Benjamin can and does put them together in a way that makes sense. I think what I would say is that one way of reading it is to say, oh, look, the whole point is simply stop history as we know it, go and strike against the current temporal regime, don't act. Right? The cessation of acting is really important. The cessation of happening is really important.
This is perhaps Agamben's.
Well, it is the part that Agamben uses when he talks about the strike. Okay. There's a second reading which involves the reconstellation of present time, in which the forgotten or imperiled history of the oppressed may well enter into or through the straight gate, and that memory emerges as exploding into the present and offering a practice of remembrance, which is also in some sense revolutionary, right? And we have to figure out, is that a different kind of revolutionary action than the pulling of the emergency brake? And I will give you an example of how I think this works. I guess many of you know, for those of you who either come from Israel or have lived there, you know, 1948 there is the Day of Independence and the day in which the State of Israel is celebrated in its foundation. And during that same time, there is the Palestinian commemoration of the Nakba, or the catastrophe, interestingly enough, which seeks to commemorate the expulsion of 750,000 or more Palestinians from their homes. There's debates about whether they were expelled or asked or solicited, but the Nakba understands it as expulsion. And the question is, can one actually have both histories being celebrated or commemorated on the same day or in one day after another? And several laws have been discussed and implemented, saying that you can't commemorate the Nakba on the day that we're celebrating the founding of the State of Israel, or you can do it, but you can't do it with public money, or you can do it the day before, but it must cease precisely on this other day. And it's an interesting moment where, like, a good filmmaker, a really good filmmaker, could take the two temporalities and see what is this interruption of one temporality by another.
It's Janus Vicker.
Okay, well, the question is, how does that? What's the possibility of one temporality interrupting another and not being foreclosed by another? Like what? And I would even say, what possibilities of translation, political translation, open up there? Edward Said said, look, in his beautiful book on Freud and the non-European, he said, look. The Jews and the Palestinians have two very different histories of displacement and exile. But why couldn't it be that precisely by bringing the histories of displacement and exile together, they would find some way of understanding each other, or some mode of translation between these two histories, right?
It's the uncommon of Nancy, perhaps.
Well, maybe so. Maybe so. It's possible.
It's related to the politics of departure and arrival that you said you were going to arrive.
Yes, maybe.
But seeking the way to do so, is it the work of the? It's the work of the materialist historian.
Well, it is a question, isn't it? And of course, we also know that the historians of that period are in huge political battles, right? I mean, who tells the story which way? Who's a revisionist? Who's a new historicist? Whose story can be told? Where's the Palestinian history? All of this. But what I don't want to actually get into that politics here, because I'm in it all the time. I want to say simply this, that there are moments where the practice of remembrance flashes up and solicits or demands a reconfiguration of the now time, right? And what would a now time be in which the dominant idea of history progress is actually interrupted by the catastrophe that it seeks to foreclose in order to continue to tell its progressive story. And this became actually a very important point between Benjamin and Sholem, because Sholem, at least in the early days of his working on the Messianic tradition in Judaism, thought that the Messianic had to be understood as momentary, fragmentary, and couldn't become part of a history or narrative of progress. But then when certain forms of Zionism said, look, it's the fulfillment of a Messianic mission to realize a Jewish homeland in Palestine, Sholem said, no. The Messianic is not about the realization of an idea in history. That can't be what it is. And Benjamin was even more strongly querying, how can that work? How can that work at all? Sholem, later in life, did agree to accept the progressive history of the Messianic and wanted to ally it with law and reason over and against the right-wing Messianists who he thought were more dangerous. Right? So his view actually changed. But Benjamin continued to argue with Sholem using Kafka to suggest that the Messianic actually had to always be counter the idea of progress and realization, and that it needed to be used more for the purposes of remembrance. And I think you can see that if remembrance involves an understanding of the history of the oppressed, it would lead to a very different understanding of Palestine and the emergence of the State of Israel. Kafka, I wanted to tell you, has this great moment. He goes to these Zionist meetings and he doesn't really know what to make of them. At one point, he says he feels like a clothes hanger in the middle of the meetings. But he actually says something quite important. He says that there was an alternative to Zionism, and it was the Kabbalah. He says it was the Kabbalah. He says that the messianic tradition from the Kabbalah is an alternative to Zionism, because he was worried about not only the progressive narrative, but the state structure and the rest.
Because the explosiveness of the idea of Messianism as realization within history
Yes.
is even much older than the political issue of State of Israel.
Oh, of course.
It's like the Chaplet Tzvi,
Yes, it is.
It's called a false messiah.
Yeah.
This is something that always is lurking behind the political.
It's true. It's true. And I think what's important for us to note is that the messianic can take progressive form, it can take anti-progressive form, it can take right-wing form, and it can take left-wing form.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Nobody monopolizes the messianic here.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And even within Sholem, his own move was, I think, quite astonishing. And it's why I'm so grateful to Agamben for making all of this available to us, but I believe that there's a history of the Messianic that doesn't get kind of fully investigated by his view, and I wonder whether the remembrance version doesn't offer us something slightly different. So I'm just going to say this, which I hope will be interesting for you. This idea of illumination I suggested to you has a history in Benjamin. There are all kinds of scattered angels and unredeemed histories throughout his work. And I just wanted to let you know about a couple of them for those of you who want to continue working in Benjamin. And one example, actually, I will talk about tomorrow morning, is the figure of Odradek from Cares of a Family Man. And as you may know, Odradek is a wooden spool with a laugh that sounds like the rustling of leaves. He seems to have no fixed abode. He's a set of remnants from another time. And he's constantly falling down a set of stairs in what appears to be a family home, but is never quite stabilized in that way. And in some ways, Odradek figures as the constant recurrence of another time within this time. So we might understand Odradek as a figure of remembrance. And also Odradek is said to flit by, which is an interesting term, hushed vorbei. And that's what the Messianic flash also does. The true picture of the past, hushed vorbei, flits by. One question. There's also a moment in his talking about his Essene translation, where he talks about what flashes up or what lights up from one language into another, right? So it's not just that one temporality interrupts another temporality, but one language also interrupts another, and something of one language flashes up in the second language. So is there a messianic moment in translation? When we talk about a revolutionary chance in the fight for the oppressed past, it's not just that we're trying to document that past or save it from oblivion. It's rather that if the oppressed past can be preserved, or if it flashes up, it breaks apart a certain amnesiac surface of time. Right? It breaks up the oblivion that belongs to present time, not Jetztzeit, but the present time that tries to homogenize all time. And the homogenization of time is something that Marx says happens under capitalism. Right? Your labor time, my labor time become equivalent, exchangeable. They become homogenized. The value of time becomes homogenized precisely when it becomes exchange value. So there is this Marxist moment here when we're talking about the homogenization of time. But it seems to me that Benjamin's remembrance does something slightly different. It doesn't reclaim the past in the name of the present or future. It doesn't try to reconstitute the past. It's not redemptive. Remembrance enacts a resistance to homogenization, and if one recognizes or seizes hold of these moments, it's what one recognizes or seizes hold of is something called a chance, the chance for revolutionary action, or a wager. Right? So there's something about chance or wager, which is part of what happens in revolutionary action. The revolutionary actor is not expressing the inexorable progress of history. The revolutionary actor is not representing the working class. The revolutionary actor is not propelled by historical forces that are understood to be deterministic. The revolutionary actor has to be on guard to seize upon or recognize these chance moments in order to have the chance to take the risk of revolutionary action. And this idea of chance or risk or wager is very different from a progressive narrative or a deterministic one. We might say that the history of the oppressed might break through the history of the victor. Remember, he says that the history we get is the history of the victor. And call into question the claim to progress, or even pull the brake on progress. But it seems to me that there's also something else that's introduced here, which is the time of the wager, or the temporality of chance. Something may enter, something might happen, and it's a strange sort of possibility that's lodged in history. Right? So if there's revolutionary action, it's contingent. It's contingent. It's a risk, it's a wager. It doesn't follow from causality or from determinism, and it's not part of any inexorable progress. There seems to be a chance that it can happen, and the messianic, if it can be recognized at all, seems not to be an event, it's not a happening, and it's not a person, it's not an individual. So neither event nor anthropos, but rather something like chance, or the sudden fragility of a dominant idea of time, or a dominant idea, the exposure of a sudden fragility in a dominant idea of time and progress, or an exploding of amnesia that seeks to deny the history of suffering, and whose denial is a precondition of the continuation of history. Okay.
It's more of a negative way of describing it.
I don't know if it's negative, because let's remember that the interruption...
Negative not in value, in the sense of value, but in the sense of it's not positive...
but let me just say this.
Definition, a negative definition.
It's true, we can't give it a single positive definition, but maybe we could end on this point, that although sometimes it seems that pulling the brake on history or causing the cessation of happening is the point of the messianic, which valorizes the strike, and perhaps the anarchist strike in particular. Sometimes it seems that the remembrance of the history of the oppressed becomes a chance for revolutionary action, and what revolutionary action does is reconstellate time itself. We could say it starts a new calendar, or we could say it produces another historical configuration of the now, so that the now is now a now time that no longer seeks to repress or foreclose the history of the oppressed, but is in fact permeated by it, or characterized precisely by the flashing up of that history within its terms. And that what that does is produce a reconstellation. I don't want to call it exactly a Hegelian moment, right? Because it's not as if one is overcome for the other, but there's now a new time that emerges. So this is how one can get from Kafka through Benjamin to revolutionary action. We're done for this morning.
Yes. The question is not new time. So
Sorry?
it reconstellates a new time.
Yes.
What is that? Like, how do you define that new time? How would you?
How would we understand it?
Yeah.
Well, I guess the example I want to give, I would say two things. First of all, one would be the disruption of that homogenizing of time that we understand as part of capitalism, but also part of ideas of progress. But it's also about allowing the remnants or traces of the history of the oppressed to be active or effective within the present.
There almost is this negativity. It's activating some sort of negative, not negative, but something that is bringing up something that has not had a value in a way. So there is some sort of negative aspect that's being activated. Not
Well, it's lost or foreclosed, and then it reemerges in spectral form, right? So that spectral or trace form becomes the chance for revolutionary action, but it also becomes the disruption of the dominant idea of temporality and the possibility either of a new one or of a now time that is it's not just cognizant of the history of the oppressed, but that takes that history of the oppressed as part of its own action, right? That's able to transform in some way the nearly fully lost history of the oppressed, to take that as the chance or moment for its own revolutionary action. And that strikes me as a little different from the strike. It's about reconstellating time and exploding the terms of time in another way. I'm sorry I can't make it more specific. It's the best I can do under these circumstances. We're going to return to it tomorrow morning with Odell Webb.